Picture this. It's August 15th, 1947, and you're a British government official watching the Union Jack being lowered in Delhi for the last time. After 190 years of controlling India, the jewel of the British Empire, you're being forced to hand it over and leave. Not because you want to, not because of some noble ideal about self-determination, but because Britain is broke. World War II has left Britain's economy in ruins. The war debt exceeds 200% of GDP. The treasury is empty. And without India's wealth to extract, there's simply no way to pay for maintaining an empire anymore. Here's what most people don't understand. Britain didn't give India independence out of the goodness of their hearts. They gave India independence because they literally couldn't afford to keep it anymore. And the loss of India didn't just end Britain's control of one colony, it ended the entire British Empire. Because India wasn't just another territory, it was the financial foundation that held everything else together. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to my Money Mint, the channel where I dive into topics related to money and wealth. All right, let's get into it. Let me take you back to 1600 and show you how the greatest wealth extraction scheme in human history began. On December 31st, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of merchants creating the East India Company. They were given a monopoly on English trade with all countries east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. At first, it was just a trading company. They bought spices, textiles, and tea from India and sold them in Europe. Normal business, but then something extraordinary happened. This trading company became more powerful than most nations. At its peak, the East India Company commanded a private army of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the standing British army. Think about that. A corporation with an army larger than Britain's official military. The turning point came in 1757 with the Battle of Plassey. After defeating the Nawab of Bengal, the company was granted the Diwani, the right to collect tax revenue, in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This wasn't a small territory. This was 30 million people. The East India Company had transformed from a trading company into a tax-collecting sovereign power. And the wealth that poured into company coffers was staggering. Within 5 years of Plassey, the company monopolized salt, betel nut, tobacco, and opium. They forced weavers to sell exclusively to company agents at prices 40% below market value. Villages that had supplied textiles for generations found themselves bound by inescapable contracts. But the real money came from land taxes. The company implemented ruinous taxation levels across Bengal, and when famine struck Bengal in 1769 to 1770, killing between 7 and 10 million people, roughly a quarter to a third of the region's population, the company provided almost no relief. You'd think they'd reduce taxes during a famine, right? Wrong. They kept collecting at the same brutal rates while millions starved to death. This wasn't incompetence. This was policy. The company's harsh revenue policies are regarded as a direct cause of the Bengal famine. They literally taxed people to death. But taxation was just one method of wealth extraction. The real genius, if you can call something this evil genius, was how they destroyed India's economy to benefit Britain's. In 1750, India's share of global industrial output was 25%. By 1900, it had collapsed to just 2%. How did this happen? Through deliberate deindustrialization. British colonization forced open the Indian market to British goods, which could be sold in India without any tariffs or duties. Meanwhile, local Indian producers were heavily taxed. At the same time, Britain implemented protectionist policies, bans, and high tariffs to restrict Indian textiles from being sold in Britain. The system was brilliantly ruthless. Britain imported raw cotton from India tax-free. British factories manufactured textiles from that cotton. Then, those finished textiles were sold back to India without tariffs, undercutting Indian manufacturers who were being taxed on their own production. Starting in the 1830s, British textiles began flooding Indian markets. The value of textile imports grew from £5.2 million in 1850 to £18.4 million in 1896. Indian weavers, who had been world-renowned for centuries, were driven out of business. Entire industries collapsed. From 1600 to 1871, The ratio of GDP per capita in India to that in Britain fell from more than 60% to less than 15%. Britain was systematically stripping India of its industrial capacity and turning it into a captive market for British goods. But it gets even more corrupt. The East India Company became the world's largest drug dealer. They financed the tea trade with illegal opium exports to China. When China objected to having their population addicted to British opium, the company started a war, the First Opium War of 1839 to 1842. Britain literally went to war to protect their right to sell drugs, and they won, forcing China to accept continued opium imports. The opium trade became the second most lucrative source of revenue for the British government after land taxes. They were running a narco state, and India was their production facility. Now, you might be thinking, surely the Indians were getting something out of this arrangement? Infrastructure, investment, economic development? Actually, they were paying for their own exploitation. In 1857, Indian soldiers in the company's army, called sepoys, rebelled against British rule. The rebellion spread across northern India and nearly ended British control. The British crushed the rebellion with extreme brutality. And then they sent India the bill. The total cost of suppressing the 1857 rebellion was charged to India. The Indians paid for their own subjugation. After 1857, the British Crown took direct control from the East India Company. But the extraction didn't stop. It accelerated. The Crown reorganized the Indian armies to a safer mix of 65,000 British soldiers to 140,000 Indian soldiers, all maintained at Indian expense. The land revenue that provided about half of the government's income went primarily to supporting this army. Then came the railways. Between 1860 and 1890, India's railway network increased from 1,349 to 25,495 kilometers. Sounds impressive, right? Development. Except the railways were financed through Indian debt, built primarily to move British troops quickly to suppress rebellions, and the contracts required that all hardware and parts be purchased in Britain, shutting out Indian firms. India went into debt to build infrastructure that served British military and commercial interests, using British supplies, enriching British companies. This is when Dadabhai Naoroji, one of India's most brilliant economists, began documenting what he called the drain of wealth. Naoroji calculated that Britain was extracting 30 to 40 million pounds per year from India, with only 250,000 pounds worth of capital being reinvested. He estimated that between 200 and 300 million pounds of India's revenue was being transferred to Britain annually without being reinvested in the Indian economy. He called it vampirism, and that's exactly what it was. When taxes are collected and spent in the same country, the money circulates and stimulates the economy. But when taxes are collected and sent out of the country, it doesn't stimulate anything. It's pure extraction. The drain affected India's employment, income, and overall economic growth. The Indian National Congress adopted Naoroji's theory in 1896, blaming it for India's famines and poverty. But the true scale of British dependence on India only became clear during the World Wars. By Armistice Day 1918, more than 1 million Indian troops had been shipped overseas to fight on every major front, from France to Gallipoli. Nearly 150,000 Indian casualties, with over 36,000 deaths. But the military contribution was just the beginning. India shipped vast amounts of military stores and equipment, nearly 5 million tons of wheat to Britain, plus raw jute, cotton goods, rough-tanned hides, tungsten, manganese, mica, saltpeter, timbers, silk, rubber, and various oils. And here's the kicker. India paid for all its troops fighting overseas. The Indian government gave Britain a gift, actually an imperial tax, of 100 million pounds. India contributed $601 million to World War I costs, an enormous sum that India could ill afford, paid to fight Britain's war. World War II was even more extreme. In 1939, the British Indian Army numbered 205,000 men. By 1945, it had grown to over 3.35 million, the largest all-volunteer force in history. Indian forces fought in North Africa, Italy, and Asia, playing a crucial role in Allied victory. But the financial cost to India was catastrophic. Britain accumulated what were called sterling balances, essentially IOUs for goods taken from India. By the end of the war, these balances were equivalent to 60% of what Britain received under American Lend-Lease. About a third of all sterling balances were owed to India alone. The British government was continuously drawing supplies from India with no payment beyond a promise to pay in the future. They were literally printing money to acquire Indian resources for the war effort. And when India faced famine in 1943, the Bengal famine that killed between 800,000 and 3.8 million people, Winston Churchill's response was chilling. Churchill wrote in a memo, "I am glad to learn from the Minister of War Transport that a strict line is being taken in dealing with requests for cereals from the Indian Ocean area. They must learn to look after themselves as we have done." While millions of Indians starved, Churchill refused to divert food supplies, arguing that Indians needed to learn to look after themselves. Churchill even insisted that Britain should present India with a counterclaim, a bill for India's defense by the United Kingdom, to neutralize the sterling debt. The Viceroy warned that suggesting India might not receive value for its sterling balances would be disastrous for India's war effort. Britain was trying to get out of paying for supplies they'd already taken by claiming India owed them money. But World War II broke Britain financially. By 1945, Britain's debt exceeded 200% of GDP. The British economy had been geared toward war production, 55% of GDP in 1944, and exports had been drastically reduced. The country had spent all its money in normal payments until 1941, when American Lend-Lease was introduced because Britain could no longer pay cash. After the war, the US loaned Britain $3.75 billion at 2% interest. Canada loaned another $1.9 billion. Britain was paying off World War II debts until December 29, 2006, 61 years after the war ended. And here's the brutal truth. Britain no longer had the money or military power to maintain its empire. India's independence wasn't granted as a noble gesture. The British government, exhausted by the recently concluded World War II, realized it had neither the mandate at home, the international support, nor the reliability of native forces for continuing to control an increasingly restless British India. The decision to leave India was announced on June 3, 1947, and British administration ended just 10 weeks later on August 15th. The unseemly haste showed Britain's desperation. They simply couldn't afford to stay. The economic impact on India had been devastating. India's share of the world economy declined from 23% at the beginning of the 18th century to just over 3% when it gained independence. In 1700, India had been 27% of global GDP. By 1947, it was 4%. Meanwhile, Britain's share of the world economy rose from 2.9% in 1700 to 9% in 1870. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredation of India. India's per capita income remained stagnant during British rule. From 1850 to 1947, India's GDP per capita grew by only 16%, from $533 to $618 in 1990 international dollars. Nearly a century of supposed development produced almost no improvement in living standards. When British rule ended in 1947, a child born in India could expect to live for just 27 years. After 50 years of independence, life expectancy had risen to 63 years. In just 5 decades of self-governance, India more than doubled life expectancy. For Britain, losing India was the fatal blow. Without India's wealth to extract, the British Empire could not sustain itself financially. Although Britain emerged as one of the victors of World War II, it had been economically devastated. The British Empire gradually gave way to the Commonwealth. By the 1960s, most of Britain's territories had become independent. The empire that had controlled a quarter of the world's population and landmass simply dissolved. India wasn't just another colony. It was the financial engine that powered the entire imperial system. Once that engine was gone, everything else collapsed. Now let's talk about what this means for America today. Like Britain's maintenance of costly Indian garrisons and global military presence, America maintains approximately 750 overseas military facilities. The post 9/11 wars have cost an estimated $8 trillion, dollars, all financed through debt, similar to Britain financing its world wars on credit. Britain's economic power was built on colonial extraction, particularly from India. When that ended in 1947, Britain could no longer sustain its global position. America's economic dominance relies on the dollar's reserve currency status, access to global markets, military presence ensuring favorable trade conditions, and mounting debt to finance the system. The British Indian model demonstrates that extraction eventually ends, war costs accelerate decline, debt becomes unsustainable, and loss of key resources equals collapse. Britain extracted wealth for 190 years, but it ended. Britain's debt exceeded 200% of GDP by 1945. Losing India meant losing the empire's financial foundation. History suggests that no empire can sustain itself indefinitely through debt-financed military dominance without an economic foundation to support it. Thank you for watching my Money Minute. If you have a topic you'd like to see me cover in a video, please be sure to let me know in the comments.